name is Floyd Poinitz, and I'm the president of Seventh-day Adventist Kinship International. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Kinship Worship, a program that's for us and by us. Kinship Worship takes place on the first Friday of each month. So please put it on your calendar, and I'd like to invite you to join us each month for an interesting and engaging program that's for our community. As we start the month of November, we're just finishing Kinship Awareness Month for October. And during the month, we had several podcasts that were of interest to our members. And tonight, we're going to replay one of those podcasts, a panelist discussion on change therapies. If you haven't yet watched the movie Pray Away, I invite you to do so. It exposes the dangers and the fallacies of change ministries, conversion therapy ministries, etc. So please sit back, enjoy, and watch the podcast for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's wonderful to have you. And I'm going to just do a very brief introduction of some of the people who will be helping us with the panel. Jerry McKay is a person who's been through this process before with conversion therapy and is going to be sharing his story in a moment. Renee Drum is a sociologist, and we will be talking more about some of her background when we come down to a little part of the program where she'll be talking a little bit more. Floyd is our president of SDA Kinship, and he will be helping us with some other parts of the panel later. So I'm glad to have each of these people joining me. We're going to start by having, and I'm Dave Ferguson. I have served as the Church Relations Director for Kinship for a number of years and recently retired, but I also participated in a conversion therapy program, and I'll be sharing my story a little bit later. So as we get started, I'd just like to have a moment of prayer as we start this time together. Dear Heavenly Parent, we're grateful to you that you care about each one of us as your children. And we pray that during this time today, we may have an opportunity to learn more about your love to each of us. We thank you for this in the name of our risen Lord. Amen.
Amen.
I also want to just say that, we've been planning this for some time, but it seems that it became even more appropriate after last week's annual council meeting, when there was a statement made by the president of the General Conference that was very negative for the LGBT community, and encouraged people to participate in a program that continues to be a program that is essentially a conversion therapy program, even though they try and not use that word and say that they're not trying to do that. It's a pray away the gay kind of program. And so this today's information hopefully will be helpful to you in responding to those who give those kinds of introductions to the kind of ministry that they're providing. So without going any further into any of that right now, we'll talk about it more later. I'd like to have Jerry go ahead and share his story with us. Jerry, go ahead.
Thanks for inviting me. I want to say I'm calling in from Ottawa, Canada, and as a Canadian and perhaps a British background, I tend to understate the impact that things have on my life. So when I recount my story with respect to reparative therapy, there is a lot of it that is very confusing and painful for me, and I won't go into all of those details. But my experience with reparative therapy, and more specifically Colin Cook and Quest Learning Center, started in the fall of 1981 in response to reading the Ministry magazine interview in September of '81. I was a missionary in Japan at the time. I was 25. I think I can honestly describe myself as being basically totally naive about sexual orientation. I had gone to Adventist high school, Adventist college, finished my bachelor in theology. I was always feeling different, like so many people say, but I had no contact with gay people. So there was very little about my experience that would have influenced my orientation. I just carried it inside very privately, ignoring it most of the time. But as I said, it was 1981 when I read the Ministry Magazine interview, and it was in relation to that interview that it's my benchmark as to when I actually named my experience, that I was dealing with this issue. And it was a tremendous emotional response to that article. It was powerful because it spoke so authoritatively about the subject, and about the promise of healing. For all intents and purposes, the article was a promise that if I did certain things, I would slowly unearth my heterosexuality, is a phrase that I like to use. And after reading that, I contacted Colin, and I was invited to consider coming to Quest Learning Center in Pennsylvania. And about a year later, I did, after returning from Japan to Canada. I went for a weekend visit in the summer of '82. I went for a second week-long visit in the fall of '82. In the spring and summer of '83, I was in Pennsylvania for 5 months. Then I left for about 9 months, and then I returned in '84 and into '85 for another 6 months. And following that experience, I returned to Canada and was in Toronto. I still had contact with Colin. My experience with reparative therapy, conversion therapy, in relation to Colin and Quest, extended from 1981 to about 1988. It's almost easier to tell my story with respect to questions. So, I mean, I look forward to any questions that people have at the end of the my story. There are so many details that I could go into, and but without being graphic, physical and psychological abuses began the first weekend visit that I had with Colin. My naivety prevented me from telling anyone about what was happening. I was confused, but also I had sold my soul, I think, to what Colin had written about in Ministry Magazine. And even though there were so many red flags, I hesitate to say what any of them were, but they were red flags. But I persisted in trying to change my orientation with Colin, because he was the spokesperson of the church at the time. I don't know if Ministry Magazine vetted anything of what Colin was saying. I think I can be honest in saying that nothing was tested or confirmed. And I was just left to believe that Colin was the authority on change. my story is just multiple details of continuing to hang on to the relationship with Colin, all in the hope of somehow unlocking the necessary ingredients to change my orientation. And I was also caught up in the idea that, especially the secular gay community, would not understand what needed to be done sometimes in order to overcome your orientation, that they would use information to discredit this kind of work. And I think that attitude is still projected by church leadership. Um, in relation to my experience then and now, um, the church does not allow the stories of other people's experiences, any contradictory stories, um, which perpetuates great harm. Um, I mean, part of my story included, when I returned to Toronto, I facilitated a Homosexuals Anonymous chapter. Homosexuals Anonymous, for those of you who may or may not know, was co-founded by Colin Cook and operates like AA. In Toronto, I facilitated that group. I worked at arm's length with a ministry there, with a similar type ministry. But at the same time, all for those years, from 1981 to 1988, my orientation was not shifting. I was living in a world of not pretense, but trying to perceive everything that happened around me as some evidence that my orientation was shifting, that I might becoming more heterosexual. It wasn't a fantasy world, but I spent a tremendous amount of time looking for evidence, hanging on to the smallest piece of evidence that I was changing. I would, even riding crowded buses when I'm packed against women, I'm trying to praise God for the warmth I felt of their body next to me, almost hoping that if I were open enough to it, I would kind of, like some kind of contagion, catch heterosexuality from them. But that it never happened. So slowly, I became disillusioned. A chronic, I would say, low-level depression. And to make a long story short, I mean, it was in the fall of 1988 that I came to the point in one day that I stopped trying to change my orientation. I mean, it was just keeping an eye on my time. It was a decision on my part, full stop, to stop changing. That did not mean I was comfortable with my orientation, that I was done with counseling, but it was also a commitment made between God and myself that I was going to stop, but I would not abandon all the things that I had done spiritually in relation to God and faith. I had just determined that God was going to have to stop any relationship with me, which wasn't going to happen, of course, but I wasn't quite sure what would happen. And I severed all contact with Colin. And I had no contact with him for about 20 years. I think they want us to speak only for about 10 minutes, and I've kind of reached my 10 minutes. And as I said, there's so many details, because I was involved with reparative therapy for 7 years. And I don't know if it will be posted anywhere, but I'm in the process of writing my story, and it is online um, with Kinship. So there's like 150 pages of detailed narrative about my experience, and it's not finished yet. So if you're looking for more details of that story, it's all there.
Thank you, Jerry. The abuses you experienced during counseling notwithstanding, is there anything you would say was missing from the process?
Um, the answer to this comes from all the many years after that. And the short answer to that is there was no informed consent. There was no um, um, information as to respect of what therapies were to be expected, how they would benefit me. It was primarily Colin's experience with his so-called change, and just him sharing that with me. Um, so that's what was missing. No sense of what to expect, um, what might be the outcome of this therapy, the risks, and we may talk more about informed consent later in the panel. But as a naive, trusting kind of Seventh-day Adventist Christian going to a church promoted counseling center, there was nothing to protect me from anything that might have gone wrong.
Thank you. What helped you move forward to heal after this experience?
I've been asked that question many times, and it's difficult to answer, but I would say that I had the courage to keep reading the perspective and the experience of many other people. I was suspicious of gay writers at the beginning because I was assumed they, of course, would be biased. But I forced myself to read and do my own research and to listen to the stories of other people. And that was easier said than done, because when the voice of authority is from the church, that kind of information and material back at that time was not coming from the church. Kinship, of course, became one of those sources, although my experience with Kinship for many years was always kind of arm's length. It started when I was in Pennsylvania, actually counseling with Colin, but talking to friends, reading, trusting my own gut, which took a long time. But that's the short answer.
And what advice would you give someone insistent on pursuing change therapy?
I like that question because I know that in the context of our present world, and even the church's position at the moment, they are going to encourage people to seek change. And if someone in the church is like myself at that time period, there is very little that is going to discourage them from pursuing counseling and some kind of reparative therapy. So my answer to that question is sort of related to the other question about informed consent. Even now, if you believe you must change, you should change, I encourage you to trust your gut through the process. If there are red flags, question those red flags. Talk to other people about those red flags. Dare to study, dare to read, dare to do your own research. Listen to all the stories, not just the stories that come from one side. And also trust that God can handle your honesty. If things are not working the way you believe they were supposed to or told they were supposed to, trust that God can handle that and your journey, and allow God to take you where you might not expect.
Okay, thanks.
So, Dave, I guess I am to give this time to you for you to tell your story.
Thanks, Jerry, and thanks so much for sharing your story. I grew up with Adventist heritage. My great-grandparents were Seventh-day Adventists, though my grandmother left the church after she finished academy time and married a non-Adventist. My mother maintained contact with the church, and shortly after I was born, she decided that she wanted her children to have contact with the church, and she chose to come back to the Adventist church. That was at the time she was pregnant with my brother. And my parents initially seemed to fit the profile of what I was fed to believe was the reason that people became gay, and that was that my mother was domineering and my father was absent. We're going to talk more about that later, but I realized when I was very young that I was attracted to men. We had a visit from one of my cousins who was in college, and he was playing some basketball. And I have a picture in my hallway at home that shows me just holding on to his leg. And it just, at that point, I knew that there was something that was happening. I didn't have any name for it at that point, and it would be years before I would. But there was some kind of an attraction there that I can trace back to a time when I was like 4 or 5 years old. By puberty, I became more aware of my sexual orientation, but I still didn't have a name for it. I didn't know that it was called homosexuality. I didn't even find that term until I was in the library while I was in college, and I discovered the word, and I suddenly realized this is a term that describes me. Just before I got to college, I felt that God had called me to be a pastor. And it was one of those experiences in my life during my first year of college where I actually asked God to prove me what He wanted me to do. And I was trying to challenge and find out what I should do. And that's where I decided that I really was being called to be a pastor. In college, I was told by uh, one of my professors that if I just found the right girl, my homosexuality would be cured. So even at that point, I was reaching out to try and find some answers. When I finished college, I got married in a big wedding ceremony, and I headed to the seminary. But in spite of the guidance that I would change because of this, it didn't work. It was about this time that I had a conversation with my mom, and she said she was accepting, but she said, "Don't tell your dad, it will kill him." And then a little while later, we were talking, and she said, "Well, you know this is something that you chose." And I said, "Mother, we've had enough conversations that you know this was not a choice. This was not something I chose. I've tried very diligently not to be gay." And as I'll explain in just a moment, some of the things that I had tried to do, I came back with her, and it was the only time I've ever hung up on my mother. But I hung up the phone and I didn't talk to her for a couple of weeks. And she called me back and she said, "I am so sorry. I know this is not something you chose." I knew that if God didn't change me, I would lose my job as a pastor, my wife, and my son. All of these were very important to me. I was willing to try anything. I was fortunate to have support in every step of my journey. There were some at this point who were trying to help me change as I was moving through this part of my journey. But this included intense praying, anointing, laying on of hands, prayer, and exorcism. I went to a Baptist pastor who was doing exorcism and tried to move through that. We spent an hour with this exorcism. And yet, on my way home, I saw a very handsome guy, and I realized, doesn't seem like anything has really changed. And so I said, isn't God listening? Doesn't he care about this? Finally, the church offered a program to change. And over the next several years, they invested millions of dollars in this program. A friend told me about it, and so I picked up my family and I moved to Pennsylvania. Took a sabbatical from my work, and it was an intense period. I often worked nights to provide for the income we needed while we were away because I wasn't being paid while I was on sabbatical. And then during the day, I would have counseling sessions. The one good thing that came out of that was that I read 40 books during that 6 months that I was in Pennsylvania. But during those counseling sessions, often the counseling session would end with a very suggestive body hug from the director of Quest Ministries. I came from there excited that I might have finally changed. I thought that my pastoral ministry that I loved would be able to continue. I kept rewarding myself for good behavior. I got a new bike. I rewarded myself by saving up money with these rewards that I was giving myself. I rewarded myself with a trip to Israel. But I still found myself attracted to men. I came to realize that I was doing behavior modification, but my orientation had not changed. I listened to others, even on It Is Written television program, who claimed to have changed, and yet they also admitted that they found other men attractive still. And I realized they were doing the same thing. They were trying to pull themselves up by the bootstraps with this behavior modification, and yet they were still finding this attractive. Eventually, this resulted in a very real depression. Like so many others who have tried conversion therapy, I started having suicidal ideations. I decided that if I was going to die, I wanted to die in nature. And so I laid out plans. And I got a hose and hooked up to the exhaust of my car. I bought a pint of whiskey, knowing that this was one of the highest levels of alcohol, and never having drunk anything in my life, I knew it would have a very quick effect on me. And I went out in nature, parked my car, hooked everything up, drank the whiskey, I chug-a-lugged it, and passed out. I woke up several hours later and realized my attempt was a failure. And I drove home hoping that I wasn't going to get picked up for drunk driving, and eventually slept for several more hours that afternoon when I got home. I knew I needed a better plan. And so I got everything ready a second time and checked everything again. It was like ready, set, stop. I decided if I was going to die, God would have to take my life. It wasn't going to be something I would do. I would not do it. I didn't realize then, but that was the first step to being free. This is the first time I've shared that part of my experience with anyone. Shortly after this experience, my marriage and my denominational employment ended with my resignation. It was just a couple of weeks later that my dad and I were on a trip to go skiing, and I was driving, he was riding, and while we were riding along, I told him that I was gay. And he said, "Pull over." I pulled the car to the side of the road. He said, "Get out." I didn't know what to expect. "Come around to the other side of the car." I came around to the other side of the car, and my dad gave me a big hug and let me know that he cared about me and still loved me. It didn't kill my dad, like my mom had earlier said. In fact, Every time I saw my dad for the rest of his life, he always made sure that he gave me a hug. It was a few years later after this that a theology professor shared a different understanding of the Clobber texts. I joined Kinship. I came out at church. I came out at work. I joined the Gay Men's Chorus of Los Angeles, and obviously being on stage, I was very out. I was finally fully free. Soon I would meet my partner. I would begin my new ministry to those in the LGBT community. I found a church home where I am accepted for who I am. God had called me to ministry and had answered my prayers. It was my journey, and it still is.
Thank you, Dave. Now a couple of questions for you. What things do you most remember about your time in conversion therapy?
I mostly remember two things. One was the intensity of those conversations that I had, and the other was the hugs that I got at the end, where Colin would come up very close, and you could feel his entire body pushing against you. So that was what kind of stood out from my time there.
Why is it called conversion therapy?
Well, there are two different terms that are often used. One is conversion therapy and one is reparative therapy. Conversion therapy is usually used by faith groups because it's a process of converting people to be something that, a new kind of life, like a conversion. Reparative therapy is used by psychologists to repair what's damaged in the person. And so conversion therapy tends to be about things that happen within the faith community.
You mentioned it briefly when you were speaking, but can you say more about the difference between behavior modification and orientation change?
Behavior modification means that you're just changing your behavior to meet what people expect from a heterosexual person. Orientation change means that you recognize that your orientation is that of a homosexual person. And so that means that you are understanding that you have accepted that change, that you are who you are, that is something that you are, and it's not something that is going to change. It's something that we are. So behavior modification is attempting to be something that really you're not.
Thank you.
Floyd, do we have any questions that have come in from attendees that Jerry and I should be answering?
Actually, can we right now move to Renee? Because Renee.
Yes, let's do that because she's going to need to leave, and then we'll come back to some.
We can
questions.
hold all the rest of the questions for later.
Yeah, that's good.
Questions, put them in the Q&A and not in the chat because it's easier to see the questions in the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, we'll move to Renee. Renee, tell us a little bit about your background. I know that you had contact with the LGBT community for a number of years, and you've done a number of papers and research. So give us just a real snippet of that, because I know our time is short for you, but I want people to understand the background that you've come to this with.
Okay. Well, I did my dissertation research from Texas Women's University in sociology. And during that time, that's when I got started with Kinship. And I was invited to speak at Kinship camp meeting. And at that time, I was teaching social work. And in social work, we teach a lot about different kinds of prejudices and bias. And whenever my students when we were talking about ageism or sexism or racism, then they would be really behind it, like, yes, we need to address these issues. But then when it came to LGBTQ plus issues, they were making more noises like, well, maybe I'll just refer those people. I won't really need to deal with them. And I certainly don't want to advocate. So that got my advocacy ire up, and wanted to do something about that kind of reception. And I thought, well, maybe if I started gathering stories, I would be able to connect with my students a little bit better, and there would be more of a name and an experience to go with this situation. And so that's what I did when I went to a camp meeting. I started gathering stories. And if you believe in just so happen, I just so happened to take a class in qualitative analysis. And from those interviews, those stories that I gathered, I wrote a paper. And when I got my paper back, at the bottom was scrolled by the teacher, just across the bottom, this would be a great dissertation, and you really have a gift for this kind of research. And so that stuck with me. And then that became the basis, the start of my journey with my dissertation. And in the end, I interviewed over 20. Right at that time, it was only gay and lesbian individuals. There's a number of reasons why other gender orientation or identities weren't involved, but you can read my dissertation if you want to. Anyway, so from that time on, one of the stories that I listened to was Jerry's. And so that helped me so much. And I'm sure that it was a real blessing for all of you that are listening right now, because his story outlines so definitively. And now to hear Dave's story, I hadn't heard his before. You really need to listen to their experiences with trying so desperately to change, and all the different kinds of trying and support and counseling and programs, and still with the same result of not changing. So that's what helped me along my journey, and I'll open it up for questions.
Could you share just a little bit more about the importance that you see for informed consent with people who are doing
Sure.
this kind of counseling?
Right. And one of the things that I do is I teach social work. My PhD is in sociology, but my master's degree and all of my practice and teaching experiences in social work. And my former life, I was in private practice in social work. So mental health is my area of specialty. And one of the things that is really important for those of you that might be considering this kind of treatment is that you should have a well-defined consent. And really what you should have for that should include several elements to it. And one of them would be a detailed treatment outline. You should know going into it just what you're going to experience. And if they can't give you that, then it's not a legitimate treatment approach. Of course, from my perspective, any kind of conversion therapy is not legitimate, but I know that it still exists. It still is legal in about half of the states. But it's been outlawed in many states as well. So anyway, a detailed treatment outline, you should have that. You should be fully informed about the risks and the benefits that would go with that treatment. So they need to outline those things. And if they do not mention that suicide might be a side risk that's involved here, then they're not fully disclosing what's going on, because people are more at risk when they are trying this kind of conversion therapy of suicide than any other kind of approach. So you really need to be well aware of that as a possibility. Also, treatment should always be voluntary. It should never be forced on anyone, especially this kind. Although, you know, if a person has a psychotic break, that's a whole different thing. But for just this kind of treatment, it needs to be voluntary. Also, it would be very helpful if the person that you were getting treatment from knew the differences and explained the differences, and you were being educated on the differences between sexual addiction and sexual orientation, or addictive behaviors in general and sexual orientation. You know, a lot of people tell a story about sexual addiction and how they overcame that addiction. That is not the same thing as sexual orientation and having a real change in that orientation. So get some education about that. That would be helpful. Also, is the treatment that you're being offered, is that accessible to other people, and especially to your guardian if you're an underage person, or is it documentable treatment approach? You need to see some evidence that there is a real chance of making the change in the direction that you're hoping to. Also, the person that you see should be supervised by someone above them, if you will, by someone that can listen to what's going on in treatment and say, hey, this doesn't sound right, or I think you're on the right track, or your client really isn't making progress in this way, try this instead. So there needs to be a supervisory situation included in the treatment. And how about malpractice? What does that look like in terms of informed consent? And when is it, we're gonna try this experimental thing, and when is it just plain malpractice? So all those are things that really should be considered in the beginning stages of any treatment.
One quick question. I know you have to go, but from the perspective of someone who's outside of the LGBTQ community, what is your message to parents or concerned pastors or even people at the GC who continue to promote pray away kinds of movements and therapies?
Of course, my heart aches for anyone that hears the pray the gay away message, because I believe that it is doomed to failure. But my message to those that are carrying that torch still, please consider the suicide rate of people that are subjected to that kind of treatment. Consider the dehumanizing aspects of the treatment. Consider how Jesus' great sacrifice for us was to come that we might have life and have it more abundantly. And I know from all the experiences that I've heard over the years that abundant living is not living in a way that their particular mind and body was not intended to work. And so we can't force everyone into the same mold, if you will. And that's really, really harmful on every aspect, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically. So, you know, I would just really plead for re-examining that position.
Thank you so much for being with us, Renee. I know that you have another appointment coming up, and we got started a little bit late, and so I put you up against the wall here, but we really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today.
My pleasure, and I wish you all the best. And feel free to share my email address if that's going to be helpful for someone. I would be willing to answer an email if there was a specific question.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. All the
Have a great
best.
afternoon.
Bye-bye.
We're going to spend just a little bit of time now talking a little bit more about conversion and reparative therapy. Since we started a little bit late, we're going to run a little bit past the 1 o'clock time. And so we talked a little bit earlier about what is conversion reparative therapy and the difference between these two. But, you know, where did it get started? You know, this kind of thing is not something that has just happened within the last 10 years or so. It has emphasis that goes back a number of years, at least 100 years that we know of, where people were trying to look and understand more about who people were. The word homosexual wasn't even a word in the English language until the late 1800s. But there were those then who, and there was acceptance of some of this, even in many other places in the world. Sometimes we think that, sometimes we hear from people in Africa that, you know, this is Western people that are forcing homosexuality on them, when in reality, it was the idea that came from the colonialism that happened in Africa that put the idea that homosexuality was not acceptable because it had been accepted in many of the places in Africa prior to that. So some of these things have been actually very distorted by religious groups. One of the people that started one of the groups in the 1980s and 90s was Charles Socarides, and his son Richard eventually came out as gay, and you can find a link to his story about his coming out to his father on YouTube. I gave that link to some of our people earlier, and if they would like to put that up in the chat, that would be available for you to see later if you'd like to watch the presentation that Richard has with that. Jerry, do you have some things to talk about that you'd like to add to origins about the reparative therapy or changing people?
I guess not really. I don't. Most of my experience is just, you know, what happened within the Adventist Church.
Okay, let's move to that then. What has been the involvement of the SDA Church? You mentioned Ministry Magazine in 1981, that article that came out. Talk a little bit more about what happened that made the church do it at that point in time.
Well, I think, I mean, historically, Colin had been writing other articles earlier than that. I think in the Insight magazine, he had a series of articles about homosexuality, and I think the topic was just coming to the notice of church leaders, and other people could address this better than I can. But I think Kinship was coming into being right around the same time, and I think I think Colin was the church's response to Kinship's appearance, because I know even in that Ministry Magazine article, Colin never addresses or mentions Kinship specifically, but he speaks about gay groups who are influencing the church, and I know his comments there were in response to that. So there was both Kinship and Colin were coming online, so to speak, at the same time. On an interesting note about ministry, I know that interview was rewritten by Colin. He did not like the form that it had taken, or maybe it wasn't written well enough, but he was allowed to rewrite it So I think even the questions and the answers are more Colin Cook than the editor of Ministry at the time.
Yeah, and it was interesting that this particular ministry magazine was circulated very widely to, they tried to get it to every pastor within the United States. And they mentioned that they had at least 1,000 responses from that one article that came out. So yeah, it was a real push from the Adventist Church to try and be a leader in this kind of change ministry.
Yes, I mean, every second issue of Ministry Magazine was sent to tens of thousands of clergy from other denominations. And that interview was in that issue that went to those groups. It really put Colin and Quest on the map.
Yes.
And Colin also had a couple of years later, I was back in Reading again for the second time when It Is Written did a couple of episodes with respect to Colin, and the little book that was put out with respect to that TV series was another response. In many ways, I think so much of the church's response has been in relation to kinship.
Yeah, there were a couple of things that happened with that. One was I did meet with Colin when he came to California for that It Is Written television broadcast. And it was just about that same time that the person who had introduced me to Quest sent me a message and said, distance yourself from Colin. He's having sex with some of the young people who are attending Quest. And so that was the beginning. One of the other things that was interesting to me was that It Is Written was the one that was trying to do this because George Vandeman's brother I knew was gay. He never did come out as gay, but I happened to see him at a place where gay people were gathering when I was growing up. And so I knew that his brother was gay, and I think that that had a huge impact on him to try and have something to try and help his brother. The same kind of thing happened with Neil Wilson because his brother came out as gay, and so he managed to help his brother find a new position away from Andrews University at another secular university in order to help him when his brother when it was exposed that his brother was gay. So, you know, some of these powerful people in the church had a lot that they were trying to do to cover up things and to move things forward. In all honesty, maybe they were doing this in a way to try and help their families to make some changes as well.
And in a broader sense, I think church leadership, and it's understandable, there's kind of a vested interest in demonstrating that the gospel is efficient and effective, and that means that in many occasions they will bend over backwards to support that idea, no matter the cost. And that has just that idea that you know, if the gospel is true, then it should be able to respond to any human condition, and that has got in the way of the flourishing of many people.
And that was the message that we got, was that, you know, if you just pray hard enough and long enough, your change will happen. That God, everything is possible with God. Yes, everything is possible with God, but you know, as we look at nature, same-sex attraction is very natural. Over 1,000 species exhibit same-sex attraction and behavior, and so it is something. While the church uses the text that talks about same-sex things being unnatural, it is very natural in the rest of nature. One of the other things that happened more recently was in South Africa with the conference that happened there several years ago. And one of the reasons that that conference was called was to try and have the church make a more definitive statement against homosexuality. But unfortunately, for leadership, that didn't quite go the way they wanted, and the vote was not taken because it became very clear at that conference that the people who were dealing with things from a scientific standpoint, the psychologists, the sociologists, and others who were dealing with things in the social science area, all said that homosexuality is not something that people choose. And that was not the message the church wanted to hear. On the other hand, the theologians continued to carry the line of the church that homosexuality is something that people choose. But it created some real questions in the minds of people that were attending that conference as to whether it was really something that people chose or whether it was something that they really are at their core. So I think that that was a very interesting result of that meeting. And then we've also seen in the last few years the emergence of another group called Coming Out Ministry, using an interesting choice of words in coming out, because usually that means a person coming out as gay, but they're twisting this to be coming out of being gay, and trying to use this. And now, as we saw last week from the annual council, the church is pushing this particular ministry as a way of trying to continue their pray away the gay theme within the church and conversion therapy. So anything else on that area? And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the results of these therapies in just a minute. Anything else, Jerry, before we move on to that?
No, not from my side.
Okay. I'd like to just have us put a couple of things additionally in the chat. On August of this year, the Baptist Church in Baptist News put out a video called Conversions That Matter, Conversations That Matter was their topic, and it was talking about the harm of conversion therapy. There's also a huge article in Wikipedia, and so if we could put both of those things in the chat, that would be great. And while we're doing that, I'm going to pull up one more thing to share on the screen. Do a screen share here. This is some information about change therapy. Over 700,000 LGBT plus adults have received conversion therapy. And the results from that research shows that those people that have been part of that are 2 times more likely to attempt suicide as a result of participating in a conversion therapy program. The other thing that's interesting is that while 20 states and 100 cities have banned conversion therapy for minors by licensed professionals, 81% of the people who participate in some kind of a conversion therapy program are participating in that with religious leaders, and therefore they're not covered by some of these bans that are being started in various parts of various states and cities because they claim a religious exemption. So 81% of the people who participate in some kind of conversion therapy are doing that through a religious leader. Most of these people are unlicensed professionals. And the result is that a lot of those people end up with higher incidence of suicide ideations, attempted suicides, and actual suicides. I wanted to try and have some people from the Trevor Project come on, and I was not ever able to get a connection with someone there to be able to do that. So let's open it up now, Justin and Floyd, to some of the questions that have come in.
Okay, the first question is, I think, for Jerry, but I guess you can answer it as well, Dave. Did therapy include shock therapy or striking you with a Bible like in the movie Boy Erased?
No, I would say from what I've seen of many other ministries, um, Collins was on a level of being rather sound and um, not sound, but not extreme. Nothing like that. Colin would not have really advocated those things. Collins counseling was about talk therapy. There was a lot of education about the cause of my orientation, which I embraced fully because I kind of fit the model, distant father, dominant mother. Not that my mother was dominant, but she had to take over and run things when my father was under the influence of alcohol. But that can still be construed into her having to be dominant, and then therefore my learned dislike for domineering women and those kinds of things. And then there was a whole lot of desensitization. Dave, you've kind of alluded to this. I experienced, the long affectionate hugs, even with the evidence of arousal on Colin's part. There was just a lot of talk about losing our fear about homosexuality, which was helpful to me, actually, that part of it. But a lot of desensitization, which also meant could lead you down a path that took you into things that were potentially abusive. And I experienced those. Colin's ministry was not about, in my opinion, not about pray the gay away. I would say that he was all about act as if you are heterosexual.
Yes.
And to me, it's a little bit like one of the temptations that Jesus experienced. I started to feel like as if you will just throw yourself off the temple in faith and experiment and push forward into heterosexuality, it will slowly emerge. Angels will bear you up as you act in obedience. It's not that Colin said that, but that was my take on it eventually. And all of it also was covered in the idea from Romans. There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And in that condemnation, there was this freedom to move forward in faith, confess your multiple failures, but keep trying to embrace and discover your heterosexuality. And that's how Colin lived. And that's what I learned to do. And it created great psychological and spiritual distress for me over time. I mean, I almost learned the worst thing that I think I incorporated into my experience was that multiple failures, if you use that term, multiple failures were far better than living in a stable relationship, because you can repent of those multiple failures, but not from a stable relationship. So you take on this whole existence that is not sound spiritually, or does not allow you to flourish or grow spiritually or psychologically. So not pray it away, but act as if it away.
Now, I mentioned at the very beginning of my story that my mother seemed to be the domineering mother and my father the absent father. My mother was a person, like Cherry mentioned, that took charge of a lot of things, but that was because my father was working 2 or 3 jobs in order to make sure that things were taken care of for us as a family. And that's why he was absent. Whenever he had an opportunity, he spent time with me. In fact, I remember him trying to help me learn how to do some mechanical things on a car. I still haven't learned a whole lot about that, but my father was good at that, and he helped me with that. And he was good at a lot of things around the house and helped me to learn how to be able to take care of things around the house. So he was only absent from, in the sense that he was gone because of the jobs that he was doing to provide for his family.
I mean, I remember taking on the idea, and the word came to me just now. Because of my mother's behavior, I had taken on this unconscious contempt of women, which fed into my resistance to women in general. So even words like that just became part of my psyche, and I'm going around trying to understand and undo this contempt I have for all women. And
yeah. Other questions, Justin?
Yes, thank you for sharing. There are two questions that are very similar. So one, well, these questions are, whatever happened to Colin Cook? And do we know if he still believes conversion can truly happen?
Jerry, you've had more contact with him recently than I have, and I think that you can answer both those questions fairly succinctly for us.
Very what?
Very succinctly, in a short way,
Okay.
since we're moving short on our time.
Well, just, yeah, I have met Colin. I met him face to face 4 years ago when I was in Denver. Colin is in Denver, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think he would acknowledge, if he were in a safe place where he felt like he could, that his experience with change was much harder than he stated publicly. I think Colin would say that he still wants to be heterosexual, but that it didn't happen. And I think he wishes that he were still in his marriage, because I think he felt like just his experience of marriage might have contributed more and more to becoming heterosexual. But I think he would be less insistent that it could change, or as easily as he led people to believe.
And eventually, as Jerry and I both know, he did experience a divorce from his wife. She left with the children. So I think that answers the question for you, Justin.
Yeah, and I'm going to combine another two questions. Why do you think the SDA Church leadership is still advocating for conversion therapy? And with that, Coming Out Ministries alleges that the only orientation that matters is our orientation to Christ. How do you counter that strangely narrow approach? So I think those two questions can be answered at the same time.
Yeah, I think the church is still consistent with what it's always said, and that is that they believe that change is something that can happen because of their particular, very fundamentalist viewpoint of Scripture. They're not willing to look at Scripture based on the way it might be in the culture in which it was written. They don't recognize that what Ellen White says, even though there's a strong emphasis on Ellen White, that Ellen White says that truth is progressive and that we should be looking for new truths all the time. And as we look at new truths within our culture, one of those truths is to look at the way that people are. And so they're ignoring some of the things that actually are things that are important to the church in order to stay by some of the things that they want to stand by. The other thing is that currently one of the reasons that this is important, just like 10 years ago when things were getting ready for the last General Conference session, there was a lot of emphasis on women's ministry. And now, as we see that more and more places are moving toward ordaining women, the emphasis is moving toward homosexuality, because that's a hot button that those on the conservative side will use to help elect leadership. And the leadership that wants to be elected is going with that heavy emphasis on homosexuality. So repeat the last part of the question about coming out ministries, and let me see if I answered that.
Coming Out Ministries alleges that the only orientation that matters is our orientation to Christ. How do you respond to this?
Okay, so yes, I believe that it's Jesus full stop, just like some of the other ministries have pointed out. But I don't believe that Coming Out Ministries is actually living up to that, because if it's Christ, then we have to go by the message that Christ had, and that was that Jesus really cared about all of the people in his society who were marginalized, and he dealt with all of those in a very loving, caring way. The people in his society that he was dealing with that were being marginalized and pushed down were women and people that had leprosy or children, and anyone who was experiencing injustice was something that Jesus cared about. And so Jesus was there to care about any of the people who were being pushed to the side. And so I agree that we're going to keep Jesus in the center, then we need to be really focusing on what he said in the gospel, what we see demonstrated in the gospels by his life.
Thank you for responding to that. One more question about Colin. Were there women in the program that Colin led?
I'm not aware of any lesbians that he did anything with. Are you, Jerry?
No, I think most women who came for counseling, Sharon saw them. That's not to say, Colin may not have spoken to and had something to do with some of the women, but no, he did not have much to do with the female counselors.
He was more interested in the boys.
There's, it's not a question, but I guess it's a comment that says, why don't we use our own clobber text, like Romans 14:22, which says, hast thou faith, have it to thyself before God. Happy is he that condemneth not himself in that thing which he alloweth. So someone was sharing that as a text we can, the LGBTQ community can use. And then
I think that there are a number of texts that we can use. When we look at biblical, at the Bible, we see that the real emphasis on the Bible is love, and loving God and loving our neighbor, learning to love ourselves. So all of these things are based in love, and we can use, there are thousands of texts in the scriptures that deal with love. There are only a few texts that deal with what we call the clobber texts, and these are texts that are really, as we look at them now, many theologians are saying they're not really dealing with anything that we would call same-sex relationships in the modern sense.
Thank you for sharing that. And now this last question is a long one, but I think it speaks to next steps in the future. Someone asked, for a long time I felt that I don't want to be associated with a homophobic church such as the SDA Church, but I've told myself that I can be of more use to LGBT people as an ally from the inside. To be honest, I don't think that's really the case anymore, and I'm seriously considering removing my name from the official books. What is your opinion about this? And do you think there's any hope of change within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or should we concentrate our efforts elsewhere?
Well, I think that there's a lot of hope on the local level. Local churches are opening up and beginning to study more and see more and more. We're seeing more and more pastors who are understanding the importance of dealing with, in love, with all of the members of their congregation, including their LGBT members. On the larger level, at the denominational level, general conference level, I'm not sure that that will ever change. But for that reason, I determined 20 years ago that, as I looked at the tithing system, tithe was to be used to provide for the spiritual support of the people. And so my spiritual support comes from two places that I consider very spiritual in my life. One is my local congregation, and the other is Seventh-day Adventist Kinship. And so my tithe goes to those two organizations that care for my spirituality. And that's how I look at the church in that standpoint. I realize that there are some things that are happening in different parts of the church, even on more organizational levels. North American Division has made some great progress with their guiding principles. What was the name of the booklet? That's designed for pastors and teachers and parents. And that booklet is great as well. So I think that we see some real progress there. When I first considered what I was going to do, some people encouraged me to maybe start a church similar to other Christian groups that had started their own church and have it as an Adventist gay church. Well, to me, that didn't make a lot of sense, because if I wasn't within the church, I wasn't going to be able to make any changes within the church. And so I think that it's important for those of us who do see the importance of accepting those who are LGBT plus to remain in the church and help to make change happen within the church rather than trying to leave the church. Though I do want to say one more thing, and that is that I realize that there are churches where it is totally not acceptable to be attending that church because of the homophobic messages that are being given from the pulpit and making those people less than what they should be. And so those kinds of churches, I don't believe a person should be attending.
Hello, and thanks for being with us this evening for this engaging topic of change ministries, change therapy. Thanks, Dave, Jerry, and Renee. Thanks for your input and your panel discussion on this pertinent topic. Like I say, if you haven't watched the movie Pray Away, I invite you to do so. You can find it on one of the streaming services on your TV, and it will give you some more information about the history of some of the change ministries. The Adventist Church, as you heard, has a long history of promoting change therapy, and we currently have a change ministry that the church is promoting now currently as well. And SDA Kinship takes a stand against any such type of ministry. If you'd like to know more information, or if you have any questions, please send me an email, info@sdakinship.org. Also like to invite you to join us next month for the first Friday month Kinship Worship. And we'll have a new speaker and a different topic for us to engage with. Remember that God loves you unconditionally, and that if you're looking for a safe spiritual community, SDA Kinship would be happy to speak with you and to have you join us. Thank you very much. Have a great day.